Title, From Rags to Riches, Then Back to the Roots. The unexpected fortune, the worn, leather-bound will felt heavy in Sam's trembling hands. The air in the stuffy lawyer's office hung thick with the scent of old paper and anticipation, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air he'd left outside. He'd been summoned here, a simple, unassuming high school graduate fresh from his graduation ceremony, to receive the news that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of his life. He'd never known his grandfather, Elias Thompson, a name whispered with a mix of awe and apprehension in the hushed tones of his mother's family history. A recluse, a titan of industry, a man shrouded in mystery. Elias Thompson was a legend, and now Sam was his sole heir. The lawyer, Mr. Fitzwilliam, a man whose face seemed perpetually etched with the weight of confidential information, cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He adjusted his spectacles, pushing them higher up his prominent nose. "The will is quite straightforward, Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice measured and precise. "Your grandfather, Elias Thompson, has bequeathed his entire estate to you. The estimated value is approximately $3 billion. The words hung in the air, unreal, unbelievable. $3 billion. The number itself felt alien, a string of digits that held no real meaning, no tangible grasp within Sam's comprehension. He stared blankly at Mr. Fitzwilliam, his mind reeling, struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the inheritance. The weight of the news pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of disbelief and utter bewilderment. His life, just hours ago, a simple future of part-time jobs, college applications, and the uncertain prospects of a young adult, had been irrevocably transformed. He was suddenly, inexplicably, a billionaire. The reality of the situation slowly seeped into his consciousness, the enormity of it crashing down like a tidal wave. His world had shifted on its axis. Gone were the anxieties of affording college tuition, the struggles of balancing work and studies, the worries about a secure future. They'd been replaced by a breathtaking, terrifying vista of limitless possibilities, financial security beyond his wildest dreams, and a burden of responsibility that felt almost unbearable. The following days were a whirlwind. The lawyer's office became his second home, a hub of frantic activity as legal professionals navigated the complexities of managing such a vast fortune. Accountants, financial advisors, estate managers, a swarm of people descended upon his life, their words a blur of jargon and numbers. He found himself swept along in a current of paperwork, meetings, and explanations that he barely understood. The simplicity of his former existence, where life's challenges had been clear and tangible, felt like a distant, faded photograph. Now, the landscape before him was vast, uncharted territory full of both dazzling opportunities and hidden dangers. The media frenzy was immediate and relentless. His face, previously unknown, became a ubiquitous presence on television screens, plastered across the front pages of newspapers. He became a subject of intense public scrutiny, his every move, every word, scrutinized and dissected. Paparazzi hounded him, their cameras flashing incessantly. He felt as though he was living in a fishbowl, constantly under observation, his privacy invaded, his life turned into a public spectacle. The new apartment, a sprawling penthouse overlooking the city, felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. The opulence surrounding him was surreal. The exquisite furnishings, the breathtaking views, the sheer size of the space. Everything was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the modest, cozy home he'd shared with his mother. He spent his nights staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights blurring into a hazy, indifferent landscape, feeling profoundly alone despite being surrounded by lavish comfort. His old friends from high school, once close companions, now seemed distant, their mannerisms altered, their conversations subtly shifted. Jake, his closest friend, who used to share his dreams of making it big, became strangely distant and evasive, his eyes lingering on Sam's new clothes, new watch, his new car. Victoria, a girl he'd always had a secret crush on, suddenly seemed more attentive, her smiles brighter, her touch lingering a little longer. Their newfound interest felt strangely transactional, as if the billions he'd inherited had become a magnet drawing them closer, their intentions obscured by a veneer of false affection. The isolation intensified. He was surrounded by people, assistants, bodyguards, financial advisors, but none of them really knew him. They were drawn to his wealth, not to him. The superficiality of these relationships gnawed at him, leaving him feeling more alone than he ever had before. He missed the simple, unpretentious camaraderie of his old life, the genuine connections that had been forged without the blinding glare of his newfound wealth. He questioned if any of these friendships were real or if everyone he was surrounded by was driven by self-interest and the allure of his fortune. The weight of expectation bore down on him, too. Society, it seemed, had predefined expectations for him, a billionaire heir. He was expected to live a certain way, to act a certain way, to fit a specific mold. The pressure to maintain a flawless image, to conform to the public's perception of him, was stifling. He felt a constant pressure to live up to the legacy of his grandfather, a legacy he hadn't even known, a legacy that suddenly felt more like a prison than a privilege. Every decision he made, from the clothes he wore to the charities he might choose to support, felt scrutinized, judged, and analyzed under a relentless microscope of public opinion. The transition from his modest life to this opulent world was jarring. The vibrant, carefree nature that had once characterized his life was slowly giving way to a gnawing sense of unease. His once bright eyes seemed clouded, and the energetic smile that had been so familiar to his friends now rarely appeared, replaced by a hesitant, almost pained expression. He found himself increasingly withdrawn, his laughter replaced by long silences, the once familiar enthusiasm subdued by a growing disquiet. He began questioning everything he'd ever known, the values he'd ever held, unsure of his place in this dramatically transformed world. The vast wealth he'd inherited felt less like a blessing and more like a curse, casting a long shadow over the life he'd once known. The initial euphoria had dissipated, leaving behind a profound sense of disillusionment and an overwhelming feeling of profound isolation. He was rich, yes, but he felt profoundly empty. The future, once a bright canvas waiting to be painted, now seemed a vast, uncertain, and lonely landscape. He had everything, yet it seemed as though he possessed nothing of real value. The path ahead was unclear, the weight of the inheritance a constant, heavy presence. And for the first time in his life, Sam Thompson felt utterly lost. A world transformed the penthouse apartment, a glass and steel behemoth overlooking the glittering cityscape, felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. Each meticulously chosen piece of furniture, each abstract painting costing more than Sam's entire previous yearly family income, whispered of a life he didn't understand, a life he hadn't chosen. He moved through the vast spaces, a ghost in his own opulent dwelling, the silence amplifying the hollowness within him. The city lights, normally a source of fascination, now seemed to mock him with their dazzling indifference. His new life was a whirlwind of extravagance. He traded his modest family home for a mansion, his used car for a fleet of luxury vehicles, his simple meals for gourmet experiences prepared by celebrity chefs. Yet, the lavish parties, the designer clothes, the endless stream of sycophants and hangers-on, felt increasingly hollow. They offered fleeting moments of distraction, but the underlying sense of isolation persisted, a constant, gnawing ache. Jake, his supposedly lifelong friend, was a prime example of this superficiality. Initially overjoyed by Sam's newfound wealth, Jake's affection seemed to morph into something more calculating, more predatory. His calls became less about catching up and more about securing loans or investments, his casual suggestions veering dangerously close to veiled demands. The easy camaraderie they'd once shared dissolved into a tense, uncomfortable dynamic, leaving Sam feeling betrayed and used. Jake's presence, once a source of comfort, now felt like a constant threat, a reminder of how easily relationships could be corrupted by money. Victoria, a stunning socialite with a smile that could charm the birds from the trees, was another face of this transformed world. She'd appeared quickly after the news of the inheritance, her interest in Sam bordering on obsession. Her conversations were laced with subtle flattery, her gestures overly affectionate, her eyes always assessing, always calculating. Sam saw through her facade, recognizing the desperation underlying her charm, the hunger for wealth and status burning beneath the surface. He declined her persistent advances, realizing that her affection wasn't for him, but for his fortune. The experience left him wary, his trust further eroded by the blatant opportunism he encountered at every turn. The isolation wasn't just social, it was existential. Sam wrestled with the weight of his inheritance, the sudden responsibility of managing a fortune that dwarfed his comprehension. He'd spent years dreaming of a comfortable future, of perhaps attending a good college and securing a stable job. He'd never envisioned this, a life of unimaginable wealth, a life that felt increasingly alien and suffocating. The pressure was immense, the expectations unrealistic. He was expected to maintain a certain lifestyle, to meet certain standards, to live up to a legacy he never asked for. The freedom he'd envisioned felt more like a prison, the weight of his wealth a crushing burden. He attempted to find solace in the familiar, reaching out to his old friends from high school. But the conversations were strained, awkward, marked by a palpable shift in the dynamics. They couldn't fully comprehend his situation, unable to bridge the vast chasm that separated their worlds. He tried explaining his feelings of unease, of being overwhelmed, but his words fell on deaf ears, misinterpreted as complaints of first-world problems. He was met with envious silence, with hushed whispers behind his back, a stark contrast to the warm friendships he'd cherished before. Even his relationship with his mother, once his anchor, became complicated. While thrilled by the change in their financial circumstances, she also expressed a deep concern for his well-being. She saw the strain etched on his face, the weariness in his eyes. She worried that his newfound wealth would isolate him further, pushing him away from the simple life and the genuine connections he'd always valued. Their conversations were filled with unspoken anxieties, with a shared worry that this immense fortune could be a destructive force. The comfortable familiarity of their bond was now overshadowed by a shadow of uncertainty. Sleep became elusive. He tossed and turned, haunted by nightmares of betrayal and loneliness. The vastness of his apartment amplified his feelings of isolation, the silence broken only by the rhythmic hum of the city and the echoing emptiness in his heart. He found himself seeking refuge in solitary walks through the city, seeking a connection to the world beyond his gilded cage. These walks, however, only intensified his feeling of alienation. He saw the struggles of ordinary people, their daily lives a stark contrast to his opulent existence. The contrast sharpened his sense of guilt, of his own detachment from the realities of life outside his world of privilege. The opulence, initially thrilling, became a torment. The constant reminders of his wealth, the luxury goods, the endless expanse of his mansion, were nothing but symbols of his isolation. He felt like an actor playing a role, forced to wear a mask of contentment while his inner self crumbled under the weight of his inheritance. The laughter of his friends, once a source of comfort and joy, now felt like a mocking soundtrack to his solitude. Their envious glances, their calculated gestures, reinforced his sense of being an outsider, an anomaly in his own life. The constant stream of people vying for his attention, the never-ending parade of sycophants and opportunists, felt more like a siege than a celebration. He longed for genuine connection, for the simple pleasures he'd taken for granted, a casual conversation with a friend, a shared meal with family, the unburdened laughter that had once been a part of his daily life. The money had bought him everything except the things that truly mattered. He was surrounded by luxury, yet he felt profoundly alone. The weight of his inheritance was more than just financial. It was emotional, spiritual, a crushing burden that threatened to overwhelm him. He was trapped in a gilded cage, his immense wealth a prison rather than a liberation. The vibrant, hopeful young man he once was felt like a distant memory, replaced by a figure shrouded in wealth and loneliness. The transformation had been complete, and it was far from the joyous future he had envisioned. His world, once simple and filled with authentic connections, had been irrevocably transformed into a landscape of opulent isolation. The path ahead remained uncertain, shrouded in the shadows of his newfound wealth and the daunting challenge of finding his way back to himself. First encounters with Jake and Victoria, the initial impression was undeniably positive. Jake, with his easy smile and disarming laugh, possessed a charisma that seemed to effortlessly fill any room. He had a way of making Sam feel instantly comfortable, a skill honed, Sam later suspected, through years of navigating high-stakes social circles. His tailored suits spoke of wealth, but his demeanor was surprisingly unpretentious, at least at first. He listened intently to Sam's hesitant recounting of his grandfather's death, offering words of sympathy that felt genuine, if a little practiced. He spoke of shared interests, a love for classic literature, a passion for restoring vintage cars, carefully mirroring Sam's own quiet enthusiasms. It was a subtle dance, a carefully choreographed performance, one that Sam, in his grief and isolation, was utterly unprepared to resist. Victoria, on the other hand, offered a different kind of charm. Where Jake exuded effortless warmth, Victoria possessed a sharp intelligence that crackled in the air around her. Her wit was dry, her observations cutting yet somehow endearing. She possessed a captivating aura of self-assurance, a quiet strength that belied her delicate features and elegant attire. She listened with an intense focus, her dark eyes missing nothing, making Sam feel both seen and strangely vulnerable. There was a certain unspoken understanding between them, a shared awareness of the complexities of their newly inherited situation that transcended the polite pleasantries exchanged with Jake. Their initial meetings took place at the sprawling family estate, a relic of a bygone era that now felt both magnificent and oppressive to Sam. He wandered through the echoing halls, feeling dwarfed by the grandeur and the weight of history contained within those walls. Jake and Victoria, seemingly unfazed by the immensity of the place, moved with a familiar ease, pointing out family portraits, sharing anecdotes about their own experiences with Sam's grandfather, a man they painted in strokes of both admiration and affectionate mockery. They spoke of his philanthropic endeavors, his eccentricities, his unwavering devotion to his work. They subtly steered the conversation towards the business empire he had built, emphasizing its complexity and the challenges Sam would face in managing it. They offered their help, their expertise, their unwavering support, framing their assistance as a natural extension of their close familial bond. Sam, adrift in a sea of grief and uncertainty, readily accepted their outstretched hands. He was alone, adrift, and their presence, their comforting words, were a lifeline in the turbulent waters of his inheritance. Over the course of several days, the three of them spent hours poring over documents, navigating the labyrinthine intricacies of the family business. Jake, with his seemingly effortless grasp of financial matters, guided Sam through complex spreadsheets and legal jargon, explaining the intricacies of investments, holdings, and future projections. Victoria, meanwhile, focused on the social and charitable aspects of the estate, highlighting the responsibilities that came with the inheritance. Sam, lacking any significant business acumen, felt himself increasingly reliant on their guidance. He was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information, the weight of responsibility resting on his young shoulders. He struggled to keep up with their fast-paced discussions, their insider knowledge and sophisticated analyses of the business. His questions, often hesitant and uncertain, were met with patience and reassurance, their expertise skillfully concealing any hint of condescension. They made it seem effortless, a simple matter of understanding the intricacies of a system they clearly had mastered long ago. The evenings were spent in relaxed conversation, punctuated by laughter and shared meals in the grand dining room. Jake told captivating stories, filled with humor and adventure, seamlessly transitioning from tales of business deals to escapades on exotic vacations. Victoria, a more reserved presence, occasionally interjected with insightful observations and witty comments, her laughter a melodic counterpoint to Jake's more boisterous style. Their carefully crafted personas created a harmonious symphony of charm and intelligence that captivated Sam, weaving him into a web of apparent friendship and trust. However, subtle discrepancies began to emerge. A fleeting glance exchanged between Jake and Victoria, a shared smirk that didn't quite reach Sam's eyes, a subtly veiled phrase that hinted at an unspoken understanding. Moments that were too brief to fully comprehend yet unsettling enough to plant a seed of doubt in Sam's mind. He dismissed these fleeting moments as the product of his own grief and exhaustion, telling himself he was overthinking, that his new companions were simply looking out for him. Yet, the more time he spent with them, the more he began to notice the fine line between genuine concern and calculated manipulation. The casual mentions of the vastness of his inheritance, the subtle emphasis on the complexities of the business, the seemingly offhand remarks about the potential for significant gains or devastating losses, these observations, at first dismissed, started to coalesce into a growing unease. One particular incident stands out in Sam's memory. During a discussion about a potential investment opportunity, Jake suggested a strategy that seemed unusually risky. When Sam expressed his apprehension, Victoria intervened, subtly dismissing his concerns and reinforcing Jake's proposal with compelling yet seemingly superficial justifications. The way they dismissed Sam's concerns, their subtle but unmistakable air of superiority, sent a shiver down his spine. It was then that the first crack appeared in the facade of their manufactured perfection. A momentary lapse in their carefully constructed image, a fleeting glimpse of something less than genuine beneath the surface of their charm. The incident, insignificant in itself, served as a stark reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that the comforting presence he had embraced so readily might not be as benevolent as it initially seemed. The weight of his inheritance, once a source of bewilderment, now felt heavy with a growing sense of foreboding. He was surrounded by affluence, yet an isolating sense of vulnerability settled upon him, a profound unease that foreshadowed the turbulent journey that lay ahead. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't yet understand, a player whose fate was being subtly manipulated by forces he was only beginning to perceive. The beautiful estate, once a symbol of his newly acquired wealth, now loomed like a gilded cage, its opulent rooms echoing with the unspoken anxieties that gnawed at his heart. He desperately clung to the vestiges of trust he still held for Jake and Victoria, but the seed of doubt, once planted, grew steadily, its roots entangling him in a web of uncertainty and apprehension, foreshadowing a battle for control far more complex than he could have ever imagined. The charm offensive, initially so captivating, had begun to wear thin, revealing a colder, more calculating reality. Beneath the surface, Sam's initial naivete was slowly, painfully eroding. The question wasn't just about managing his grandfather's legacy, it was about protecting himself from the people he had so readily embraced as allies. The game had begun, and the stakes were far higher than Sam had ever anticipated.